Greetings, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is an organization that's over 100 years old. We're a faith-based policy and organizing network, and our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a justice-seeking United Methodist movement, engaging people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. And we co-host a series of webinars with our partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response. As we gather from many places, we acknowledge this land and the many lands that you are joining us from. Its history and all the being seen and unseen, known and unknown. And as we step into our work on these many lands, most of us as uninvited guests, we offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice as we strive to uplift the legacy of this place and these places. We invite you to acknowledge the indigenous land of where you are joining from and type that in the chat. A few announcements concerning our conversation and call today. By participating in our webinars, we covenant together to co-create an equitable and brave space where we learn, engage, and grow in relationship together. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days, so you'll have access to that later. And as you have questions, we invite you to type them in the chat. You don't have to wait for the specific question and answer time. We don't want you to forget your questions, so feel free to add them in the chat and we will make sure we pass those on to our moderator. We do have closed captioning available. It is automatically generated, so do know that you'll see some spelling errors and other errors, but you can access that by clicking the three dots with more underneath and clicking subtitles, show subtitles. Our moderator today is Teresa Basile. Teresa is a member of UMKR Steering Committee and their Communications Director. She's a member of the board of FOSNA, Friends of Sabile North America, and previously served on the Steering Committee of US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Teresa also serves on the leadership teams of MFSA in the California Pacific Conference and the Western Methodist Justice Movement, both of which mobilize United Methodists for action on a wide range of justice issues. Thank you for being here with us, Teresa, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Bridget. And thank you everyone for being here. It's great to see so many people here with us. Let me tell you a little bit about UMKR. United Methodist for Kairos Response is a grassroots movement for Palestinian human rights in the United Methodist Church. Our goal is freedom, justice, and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis. And we engage in boycott and divestment campaigns, political actions to change government policy, and education, such as this webinar, to help our church and our societies understand what is happening in the Holy Land and how we can support the Palestinian people in their struggle for justice and liberation. So this webinar we are having today, in this webinar, we're presenting one of the most important subjects that exists about Palestine and Israel. It's a crucial subject for anyone who wants to understand what is happening today between Palestinians and Israelis. And that subject is the Nakba. That word means catastrophe in Arabic. The Nakba is the catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people in the 1940s when they were expelled from their homeland in vast numbers and their communities and their society were destroyed to make way for the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Why are we focused right now on the Nakba? Because this month, the entire world is commemorating a very sad and momentous anniversary. This week, in fact, the world has been commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Nakba on May 15th. And for the first time ever, the United Nations officially commemorated the Nakba with events this week. In fact, even some mainstream media in the United States and elsewhere in the world has been telling their readers and their viewers about this terrible anniversary. Nevertheless, this history is not something that most people will hear anything about from their teachers or their political leaders or mainstream media most of the time. It is crucial history to learn, for it is fundamental if we hope to understand what is needed to achieve justice and a lasting peace for the people of Palestine and Israel. And to help us learn about the Nakba, we could not have asked for two more appropriate speakers, Ilan Pappé and Samia Khoury. Ilan Pappé is a world-renowned author, widely regarded as the preeminent voice among Israel's new historians. His courageously groundbreaking work of 2006, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, draws upon previously classified archival evidence and clearly presents to the world the truth about Israel's birth and the ideology that drove it, that the forcible removal of the indigenous Palestinians from their homeland was wholly intentional and was considered essential for the creation of the State of Israel. Ilan Pappé's large body of writing includes a history of modern Palestine, One Land, Two Peoples, and 10 myths about Israel, among many other works, and numerous articles of analysis and commentary, including Using the Right Language, the Incremental Genocide of the Palestinians Continues. Professor Pappé founded and directed the Academic Institute for Peace in Givat Haviva and was the chair of the Emil Tuma Institute for Palestine Studies in Haifa. He was a senior lecturer in Middle Eastern history and political science at Haifa University. Today, he is professor of history and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. Besides his focus on the modern Middle East and Israel and Palestine in particular, he has also written on multiculturalism, critical discourse analysis, and power and knowledge in general. We also have with us Samia Khoury. Samia is a Nakba survivor, and throughout her life, she has been a leading voice in the Palestinian Christian community. She has written and spoken widely on all aspects of the Palestinian experience, from her vivid recollections of the Nakba to the current realities of life under the Israeli military occupation. Some of her recollections can be found in her article, The Nakba and Its Aftermath. In her 2014 memoir, Reflections from Palestine, A Journey of Hope, Khoury beautifully explains the wide-ranging social and political problems facing Palestinians under occupation through the sweet and sorrowful experiences of family and community life. Samia was educated in the US at a Methodist-affiliated college, and she is a co-founder of Sabil, the Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center in Jerusalem. She's also a founding member of Birzeit University Board of Trustees and former president of the Palestinian YWCA, among many other roles she's filled in Palestinian society. So welcome to both of you, and it is so good to have you here for this discussion. This webinar is going to be longer than usual because this is such an important topic. We are going to be going for an hour and a half. We're also going to be doing this with an unusual format for us. Interspersed with our live conversation, we will be watching some video clips from an excellent film on this subject of the Nakba. That film is 1948, Creation and Catastrophe. So we're going to start with that immediately. Bridget Cabrera, who you met at the beginning of the webinar, will be managing our technical aspects. And so Bridget, can we please have clip number 1?
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict can seem impossible to comprehend. By looking at the year that most changed the lives of Israelis and Palestinians, 1948, it becomes possible to understand the forces that drive this conflict today. For Israelis, 1948 was a year of creation. The terrible injustices Jews had faced throughout the world would finally come to an end with the realization of their long sought-after solution, a Jewish state in Palestine. For Palestinians, 1948 was a catastrophe. That one year saw the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns, their inhabitants replaced by outsiders from Europe and Russia, and most Palestinians would never see their home again.
And Bridget, I'm going to take you by surprise. Can we go straight to clip number 2?
In the 1800s, Jews across Europe and Russia suffered persecution in many forms. Racial stereotypes of Jews were rampant. Movements called for boycotting Jewish businesses. In many places, Jews were not allowed to attend universities, were forced to live in certain neighborhoods, and were prevented from entering roles in government. In other places, whole towns would rise up against their Jewish populations and attack them en masse, resulting in looting, robbery, rape, and massacres. Jews began to look for a way to end their suffering. Some came up with the idea to bring all of the Jewish people out of Europe and settle in a place where they could finally be secure. The place they chose was Palestine, and the movement, formed at the end of the 19th century, became known as Zionism.
Well, what the Jews did in their little circles and societies abroad, which promoted Zionism, as it came to be called, is they gathered some money and then they sent off a family or a group of 20 people or whatever to Palestine. They bought little chunks of land and established small settlements.
הרוח הייתה בהחלט של רוח של תקווה ושל התלהבות והרגשה שפה בונים משהו.
Europeans had been colonizing land across the globe for centuries, and Zionism would follow in that tradition. But there was a problem that was overlooked by a popular Zionist slogan about Palestine.
A people without land for a land without people. Okay, so they wanted to give the Jews a land because they didn't have land. But the problem is that the land they gave them had people. It was inhabited by Palestinians for thousands of years.
During World War I, the Zionist movement scored a major victory. The British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour declared support for the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. A few weeks later, the British Army conquered Jerusalem and began implementing the Balfour Declaration. In the early years of the movement, calls for removing Arabs from Palestine were not often made publicly by Zionist leaders. But as larger and larger groups of Jews began arriving in the country, discussions about encouraging the native population to leave by purchasing their land or through other means began to spill into the open. The Arabs watched the arrival of more and more Zionists, saw the growing number of those who had lost their homes, and heard pronouncements by some Zionist leaders that they had plans to one day outnumber the Arabs.
The Arabs revolted. In 36, 39, they revolted against the British and against the Zionist presence.
The leadership of the Zionist movement and the leadership of the Palestinian Arab population. They both have made the same diagnosis of their situation, and this is what they understand, that the establishment of any type of Jewish state in any part of Palestine where there was going to be a Jewish majority necessarily required the large-scale displacement of Palestinian Arabs.
In 1940, Joseph Weitz wrote in his diary, "The only way is to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries. All of them, except perhaps Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Old Jerusalem. Not a single village or a single tribe must be left."
Thank you, Bridget. And I think now I'm going to be joined on screen by the rest of our panel. There was a lot in there to unpack. Those clips covered more than most of our clips will. I'm wondering, Samuel, we saw you speaking in there, and you you brought up that subject of the early Zionist slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land. I'm wondering what you think about that now, and your thoughts about the justification of anti-Semitism, the experience of anti-Semitism that motivated this Zionist plan to come and colonize Palestine. Can you share some of your thoughts about that?
Well, the whole thing, I think, started on the basis of injustice, on a fake statement, that the land was without people. Starting from this point, it's very clear that this was a wrong premise. But at the same time, we realized, that the Jewish community was being suffering in Europe and under Christian, actually, rule for many years. But we didn't have to be the victims. We ended up being the victims of the victims. That was no solution for the Jewish problem, to evict another people and claim, starting from the Balfour Declaration, his promise to establish a Jewish home. And it says, establish a Jewish home, not to take over the whole state. And the Jews accepted that, and they knew, even from the partition scheme, that they knew they were going to take the whole land. They were scheming for that and planning for it properly. We were the owners of the land, so we probably took it for granted that this is our land. We didn't do much about it. But the people who is going to steal the land, just like any robber, when you steal something, you have to plan for it. And that's what they did. They planned, and they planned it in a genius way. And of course, you will hear about all the atrocities that they made to get rid of the population, Palestinian population, and create that land.
Thank you. Ilan, is there more that you can share with us about these early events that that led to the birth of Zionism and the beginning of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine?
Yes, I think it's important to understand that there were two impulses behind the Zionist movement, the creation of the Zionist movement. One impulse was indeed, they were among many other Jews who were looking for a way to ease the suffering of Jewish communities, not all over the world, but Jewish communities, particularly in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, who were suffering from pogroms and anti-Semitic policies. Now, of course, there were various ways of dealing with anti-Semitism, and most of the Jews, in fact, opted for being part of wider political movements that hope to make societies in general more equal, less racist, whether some people chose socialism, some people believed in liberalism. Most of the Jews who decided that there's no chance for change within Tsarist Russia moved to the West, to Western countries in Europe, or as we know, to the United States. Many of them moved to the United States. So among a minority of people, the idea was actually that going to Palestine is the best solution for anti-Semitism, although most of the Jews did not believe in it. The reason that they chose Palestine is the second impulse. And that impulse was very much influenced by Christian fundamentalists, especially evangelical churches, who already before Jews were thinking about it, were talking about the return of the Jews as part of a divine scheme that would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead. There was a great influence of what today we probably will call Christian Zionists. So let's call them the early Christian Zionists, who started propagating these ideas already in the 1820s, about 60, 70 years before the creation of the Zionist movement. And they planted these ideas in the early Zionists that actually Judaism is not a religion, it's a race, it's a nation. Now, if it's a nation, then it needs a homeland. And then you can see the logical connection between the land of the Bible, I mean, from a Jewish perspective, the Old Testament, of course, the land of the Old Testament as being connected to this nation state. Now, even that by itself does not explain to us what happened in the years before the Nakba. What really is important, of course, is that the moment that there were enough allies in the Western world who, for religious reason and then later for imperial reason, in the case of Britain, who believed that actually colonizing Palestine and making it a Jewish state serves their theological or their strategic vision, it gave quite a few number of Jews the idea that this is feasible. Now, I think most of the early Zionists knew exactly that there were other people there. If you read the diary of Theodor Herzl, if you read the early reports of the first Zionist settlers who came to Palestine, they say quite clearly, as one of them put it, that the bride is beautiful, but it's married to another man. But they also, at the same breath, saying, but we have the power to remove the people and make it a Jewish state. And I think that's the origins of this. So, and I will finish by saying, on the one hand, yes, of course, Jews who came to Palestine, quite a number of them were running away from anti-Semitism. And definitely, in the case of the Holocaust, were probably running away from extermination. But the fact that they thought that salvation means victimizing the Palestinian by colonizing it makes this connection immoral and irresponsible and unacceptable. So it's not a complex story in that way. It's a very tragic story. And I would just add that the Palestinians would have received the Jews as refugees. They would have received them as refugees. They could never receive them as colonizers.
Thank you. That was great. It's interesting that those very early roots of Christian Zionism don't come up very much in this narrative when we talk about the Nakba. We talk about Christian Zionism in current times, but not the effect it had that far back. That's very interesting. And you both made very clear the immorality of what was being planned, regardless of what the motivations were and the conditions in Europe that were catalyzing this. Well, another thing we heard in those clips was that the Palestinians were becoming aware during these years of heavy immigration from Europe of what the plan was, what Zionists were planning to do to immigrate in large enough numbers to eventually take over. And they therefore, I would say quite understandably, started to revolt against this plan, against the British and the immigrants that were in their midst. And the British successfully suppressed that revolt, but they also began to limit or completely cut off Jewish immigration. And that put them in direct conflict with the Zionist movement and with their militias. And you have, I think, some memory of that, Samia, your family's experience of that period when, before the partition plan, before the ethnic cleansing began in earnest, when the Zionists were fighting the British. I wonder if you could share that with us. And you are muted.
Well, I think the Jewish underground, they were terrorizing the British as well, because they wanted to get rid of them. Not only, they wanted to get rid of the mandate so that they will do what they wanted. And one of the very, very serious blasting was the offices of the administration of the British mandate, which was a wing of the King David Hotel. They bombed that and it killed around 100 people. They did it on a Saturday, so that the minimum of the Jewish employees would be there. And mostly they would be Palestinians and some British. I mean, they worked, some British worked on Saturdays. Whether it was by divine intervention or whether it was a miracle, I don't know. But my father was one of the 3 assistant secretaries to the British General Secretary at the time of the mandate. And he resigned. He resigned after 2 years of working in that post. He resigned because he could see the plan the British were planning to help the Jews get settled in Palestine. And he just couldn't take it anymore. And on that day, he was supposed to go and hand over to the person who took over after him, Atala Mantura. And after he reached the gate of the King David Hotel, he looked at his watch and he said, "It's a little bit early. I'm coming to have lunch at the YMCA across the street. I might as well go and see my friend Aizat Manous down the hill in Mamilla Road." He hardly reached Mamilla when the building blew up. I mean, we'll never forget that day. And that was really the beginning of our being terrorized and scared. And shortly after that, you know, the Christmas of the Greek Orthodox at the Semiramis Hotel, they got another bombing there. And also a whole 2 families who were in charge of that hotel, they almost perished completely. And that was also part of one of the reasons that the Katamon people were one of the first people to leave the area when things became very, very tense and serious. Of course, that was in the wake of the Dar Yassin massacre, which in 1948 was very, very, this was one of the first terrorizing incidents in our area, in the Jerusalem area. So many others took place, of course, in the Galilee, which Ilan has recorded in his, excuse me.
Well, let's turn to Ilan. Yeah, can you tell us, Ilan, more about what was going on in this period and maybe pin down the years we're talking about also?
Yes, the period leading to 1948, I suppose, that's what you were talking about with Samia, not so much 48 itself, I suppose we'll get there. Not much to add to what Samia said. I would just say an aspect that I think is quite often overlooked by those who are trying to understand the Palestinian resistance during 1918 to 1948, during the 30 years of British rule. The Palestinian elite, whatever we think about it, which was to begin with was a very Arab Ottoman elite that was moving into modern times, and during the 1920s and 1930s was slowly replaced by new middle class in the towns of Palestine with a bit of a different worldview, whoever they were, from the end of the First World War, when they were engaged with Britain, and many of them were pro-British, when they were engaged with Britain about the future of Palestine, they conveyed, and this is very well documented in the various inquiry commissions that visited Palestine and where Palestinians represented the Palestinian point of view. They conveyed very clearly that there are 2 principles that they are learning from the West, which seems to be very positive in their eyes. One principle is the principle of democracy. And the second principle is the principle of self-determination. They were very impressed by President Woodrow Wilson's ideas of self-determination and democracy. And when Wilson sent his 2 friends, Charles Crane and Henry King, in the famous King-Crane Committee in 1919 to find out what do the Palestinian wants, and we have all the documents. The Palestinian delegation told them what we would like to implement here in Palestine, the noble ideas of President Wilson. Namely, instead of being under an empire, such as the Ottoman Empire, we would like to be a nation with a state, a democratic one, that implements its right for self-determination. And this position was there all along the mandate. However, when these inquiry commissions met the Zionists, they heard something very different. The Zionists were against democracy in mandatory Palestine because obviously they were a small minority, and had there been democratic elections in Palestine during the mandate, the vast majority of people in Palestine would have voted for Palestine, not for an Israel, so to speak, right? And secondly, the Zionists said that the Palestinians don't have the right for self-determination because they are Arabs, and they can have a self-determination outside of Palestine. This was the declared position of the Zionist leaders. And you can see how Palestinians would feel betrayed throughout that period. I mean, here they are welcoming the West, not as imperialists, not as colonialists. They're saying, okay, you're bringing with you the message of self-determination, the message of democracy. We in Palestine are embracing it, and you are betraying us. You are betraying us. And this sense of betrayal is very powerful in the Palestinian resistance. It's not a nation, and Samia knows it. The Palestinians are not a nation of warriors. It's a very peaceful nation. Palestinians really like to live normal and very natural life. They're not crazy about confrontations and wars and so on. But they were really forced by the British, because one should add another aspect of these inquiry commissions. Each one of them, and there were about 5 of them, each one of them warned the British government that if it would allow unlimited Jewish immigration and unlimited Jewish purchase of land, it would be an existential danger to the Palestinians. These inquiry commissions warned the British government. And the British government heeded a bit too late with this when it started to limit. By the way, it never stopped it altogether. It limited the immigration, and the Zionists did an underground immigration. So quite a lot of Jews continued to arrive in Palestine. What they did succeed, although it was not so much their success, is to limit the purchase of land. But the purchase of land of the Zionists was limited not just because of the British policy, because somewhere in the 1930s, even the landlords who were selling land to the Jews understood the purpose of Zionism and stopped selling lands to the Jews. So the Zionist movement altogether got less than 6% of the Palestinian lands by 1948, which is one of the reasons they used force. So I think it's very important to understand the betrayal of the West and Britain in particular of both promises made to the Palestinians, but also of the principles of democracy and self-determination. And this, as you know, impacted the whole Arab world. It's not surprising that the Arab world never really put its trust in democracy, because for them, democracy was a method for the West to colonize and to use its own interest at the expense of the local people. Democracy doesn't have a high rating nowadays, and that's one of the reasons. American Orientalists like to say it's because that the Arabs can never be democratic. That was the old Orientalist idea, that Arabs cannot, eschew democracy. It's not true. It's just the message from the West was democracy is not for you, it's for anyone else. And I think that's a very important aspect I would like to highlight.
Mm-hmm. It's very helpful. That's another point that I don't think's ever been brought into this narrative. And it's still obviously true today that we say we're exporting democracy when we're trying to supposedly liberate nations in the Gulf. And clearly that is a propaganda talking point. There are other motives underlying underneath. Thanks. All right, we are going to move on, and we're going to, for this next clip, I think I'm going to be asking for some very quick comments, and then we'll go to the one after that. But Bridget, right now, can we have clip number 3?
In 1947, the British gave up on trying to find a solution between the Zionist settlers and the native population. Exhausted from World War II, the British declared that they would leave Palestine and handed the problem over to the United Nations. At the UN, a committee decided that the best way forward was to split Palestine in two, giving one state to the Jews and the other to the Arabs. Jerusalem would become a separate entity administered by the UN. The Jewish community in Palestine had skyrocketed throughout the Zionist movement. But in 1947, it still only represented 1/3 of Palestine's population and owned less than 7% of the land. The United Nations partition plan called for giving 56% of the country to the Jewish state. This proposal shocked the Arab community. Not only would the Jews receive over half of Palestine, but they were also receiving most of the land suitable for farming.
Nobody felt that this was a fair deal.
The overwhelming majority, more than 55% of a country that had a 2/3 Arab majority, was being given over to the minority. And the area that would have been given to the minority was almost equal in population between Arabs and Jews. So there was a negative reaction to the partition of the country at all. People felt it's a single country, it shouldn't be partitioned. But then the specifics of the partition were found unjust and unequal in the minority was being given most of the country.
But in the wake of the Holocaust, world leaders felt compelled to do something for the Jewish people. In the United States, President Truman was facing re-election and intense lobbying by Zionist leaders. As a result of those pressures, he began supporting the UN partition plan.
Truman, you might say, unleashed American diplomats to threaten certain countries. So you change your vote or else. And it worked. The vote passed to have partition.
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Partition passed 33-13. And is this crowd excited? They're starting their horror dances now. All over the square, little circles are forming. People are laughing and crying and shouting and whirling around in the wild horror dance.
All right. Well, that's certainly a huge subject to talk about. But again, I'm going to encourage us to do this one briefly because we have some other very big topics about the Nakba to cover. So your thoughts about the UN partition plan. What do we need to know about it? I'm going to ask Samia again first. From your perspective as a Palestinian, what did this mean for the Palestinian people? What did this mean for you personally, for your family? You're muted.
We never accepted that because it was not fair. I mean, we're the owners. I remember my father commented at that time. It's quoting the sage King Solomon saying, you know, that the owner of the real owner of the child didn't want her son to be partitioned, divided, you know, between the woman who was claiming it's her son. And because we felt this is our land. I mean, we've always lived here, and Jews were living also with us. I remember our neighbors in Safed, where we had Jewish neighbors, I mean, and they were Palestinians, and they were part of the, well, of course, we didn't realize how much scheming was taking place at the time, but unfortunately, you know, this generation of our children now, they have never encountered a Jewish person except as an Israeli soldier who's harassing him and occupying him and so on. But back to the injustice of the partition in the first place, because of course we felt sorry for what was happening to the Jews in Germany, but that was no solution to deprive us of our country and to deprive us of our rights as the legal owners. Over and above, I mean, the injustice of the partition, even when we're such a minority, took over 56% of the land, and the original people were taking 42%. It is basically the basic injustice of the idea of partitioning the land to start with, and how they partitioned it. And so it was not acceptable. And of course, everybody said, you created the refugee problem by your own will, you know, the Palestinians. We were blamed that we created the refugee problem. Had you accepted the partition, it would have been all right. We know very well that the Jews were not, they were accepting the partition because they had further plans to take over the whole of land. And it was very, very clear, and it's documented, that we will accept now, and then later on we will take over the whole rest of the Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, wonderful. Ilan, your thoughts about what the UN did at this time, and maybe just a thought or two that I will throw in there, that what a young institution it was and how inexperienced they were.
Yeah, definitely. The United Nations was, the two things about the United Nations, one, it was a young organization, and probably the question of Palestine was the first serious question it had to deal with. Secondly, it did not represent most of the world. I mean, most of the world was still colonized. And most of the nation states of the 50s and the 60s were not yet nation states because they were under colonial rule. So it was really the Western consensus about Palestine. And as I noted before, the Western consensus was that Palestine should be the solution for the Jewish problem of the West, rather than the Jewish problem in the West should be solved in the West. So the Palestinians had very little chance of putting forward their position. Again, we should remember the Palestinian counter position was, like in Egypt, like in Iraq, like anywhere else in the world, the majority of the people of Palestine would decide the future of their homeland. And this was denied to them, and they had to to petition their homeland, and even ask to give a larger section of their homeland with most of the natural resources to a movement of settlers. Most of them arrived 2-3 years before the petition. I mean, any person in the world with a modicum of decency in them would have rejected such an idea. And the Palestinians also compared it later on, and rightly so, to North Africa. They said, would you expected the Algerians to give half of Algeria to the French settlers, who, by the way, were much longer in Algeria than the Zionist settlers were in Palestine? So as Walid Khalidi used to say, there was nothing moral, nothing just, nothing pragmatic in that resolution. It was really an anti-Palestinian resolution that was meant to help the Zionist movement to colonize Palestine, and one can fully understand the Palestinian rejection to it. I would just add one thing, that the United Nations made a terrible mistake which it realized a bit too late later, and even the Americans realized it, by saying that if the Palestinians don't accept this resolution, we will force it upon them, which is really ridiculous and outrageous in many ways, because, you know, the Palestinians, and later, as I say, some United Nations member states, and definitely the American State Department, said, okay, if the Palestinians don't accept it, we have to continue and talk about the future. We cannot impose it on the Palestinians. And that was a terrible mistake. The United Nations carries huge responsibility for the disaster of the Palestinians, and not just by the petition resolution itself, but by the decision to impose it on the Palestinians.
Thank you. Yes. That's a wonderful and very helpful summary of what they did and what was wrong with what they did. Not only the plan, but the intention to impose it, which they had no authority or moral right to do, and making that point of the size of the institution, and the very few nations that were able to be members of it at that time. We're still talking about events that precede 1948. But at this time, this is where the serious plans to begin the ethnic cleansing of Palestine would get started, with this partition plan as an excuse and a motivation to begin to appropriate the land. So we are going to begin now to hear about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in action. Perhaps the most foundational aspect of it, which is Plan Dalit. And Bridget, can you play for us clip number 4?
The British had announced that they would complete the evacuation of Palestine on the 15th of May. Zionist leaders began preparing for a Jewish state. On March 10th, the Haganah adopted Plan Dalet, also known as Plan D. This plan outlined an overall strategy for the Jewish militia. Its stated goal was to prepare the coming Hebrew state to defend itself once the British army had left. But historians strongly disagree about the intentions of the plan.
It's geared, and it says that it's geared, to securing the Jewish state and the border areas and the main roads between the Jewish urban concentrations, to securing the Jewish state in advance of the Arab invasion.
It's completely ridiculous. I mean, it's very clear that Plan Dalet was a plan not just to take over, but to empty of their population all of these villages and cities. Now, were there people who understood that writing down on paper, we will expel this population, was probably not a wise thing to do? Yes, but was there a clear intention implemented to the letter to expel the populations, and more importantly, not to let them return? And there was.
The most important part of Plan D was the set of orders that came outside of Plan D. The orders were strikingly clear and unambiguous, and used the word letaher in Hebrew, which is to cleanse, or to destroy, which is lahashmid, or to expel, which is legaresh. I think the role of the historian is to fuse these military orders with the plan itself, and then you get an idea of the intention and the implementation.
Okay, there it is. Maybe the core issue when we talk about the Nakba, the fact that the ethnic cleansing was in fact planned, quite intentional, very systematic. I have to say, I'm surprised that there could be any disagreement about it, that an historian like Benny Morris, another one of the so-called new historians of Israel, given all the material that we just saw in that short clip and all the material that he and you uncovered, could ever propose that Plan Dalet was simply for the defense of the borders of the country, come an attack from other nations. So maybe you could address that, Ilan, for us, and expand on the what you know about this plan.
Yeah. First of all, the position of Benny Morris or Israeli historians who kind of reject the idea that Plan Dalet had anything to do with the expulsion. As I explained in the clip, they decide not to mention what was called the Situation D, or Matzav Dalet in Hebrew, which was a group of orders emanating from Plan D that showed the direct connection between Plan D and massive ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It's not, and I think it's very important to see the picture in its entirety rather than kind of analyze a document and see how it works. Anyone who is familiar with ethnic cleansing cases in history knows that you cannot just take one document as a kind of smoking gun document and only through that document decide whether there was a master plan to dispossess a whole nation. You can't even do it for the Holocaust in terms of genocide or anywhere else in the world where there was genocide or the genocide of the Africans who became slaves. There is no master document who says we will eliminate millions of Africans. I think what is important is the whole context, and the context is that in March 1948, the Zionist leadership understands that the British mandate is over, that they have only 6% of the land, and they're not the majority of the land. They're not even the majority, or they're hardly the majority, even in the state that was offered to them by the United Nations. And the main worry of the Zionist leadership was the Palestinian elite in the cities and the towns. Under the noses of the British, when Britain was still responsible for law and order, in April, from mid-April 1948 to the very beginning in May 1948, within 3 weeks, the Zionist forces ethnically cleansed most of Palestine's towns, the Palestinian towns, or most of the Palestinians who lived in towns. Some were pure Palestinian towns, some were mixed towns. So within 3 weeks, under the orders that came from Plan D, the population of Jaffa was expelled, the population of Haifa was expelled, of Baisan, of Safad, of Acre, of Tiberias. It happens about 3 weeks after Plan D. I mean, you really have to be historically blind, not to see, ideologically blind actually, not to see the connection. Now, of course, I don't believe that they think that way. I'm sorry to say this. I don't think Benny Morris believes half of what he says. It's a very opportunistic point of view. He says it because he didn't enjoy, and I understand it because I was in his position. It's not nice to be treated as a traitor by your own community. I know it. So he decided that this is the best way of getting the warm embrace. But he's not the top. He's not the issue. The issue is really the fact that you have here a political and military leadership that understands very well 3 things. One, that the Palestinians don't possess the military power to prevent their ethnic cleansing. That's one thing. The second thing, they understand that the Arab world would first of all respect the mandate, would not send troops before the end of the mandate. And even when it would send troops, and they knew about it, it had its own wars of liberation to fight and its own interest. And therefore, there was no chance that the Arab world would use its real might to save the Palestinians. That's the second thing that the Zionist leadership understood. And the third thing that they realized was that the world, few years after the Holocaust, would watch the ethnic cleansing of Palestine with the massacres that were part of it, and would say it's a small injustice to correct a large injustice. Mm. They write about it like this, the Zionist leaders. They knew exactly that this was the situation. They were not at all surprised by their success. In fact, they were disappointed that they only managed to expel half of the Palestinians and not all the villages. And the reason was that there was Palestinian resistance, there was Palestinian resilience, and they themselves didn't have the capacity to complete the ethnic cleansing, which they will try later on to complete by other means.
Yes, thank you. And that makes the point that so much of what they did was by no means a response to any attack on Israel. This was, in fact, as you pointed out, immediately after Plan Dalet was initiated. And in fact, the Arab nations, when they finally did get involved militarily, and as you said, they waited until the British mandate officially ended, the middle of May. They didn't bring their full force by any means.
If I may add something, Theresa, because I think that's very important. The most important bit of the Israeli propaganda, which unfortunately some even of Palestine friends accept, is that the Arab world started a war against Israel, and the Palestinians became victims of this war. Mm-hmm. This is not the chronology. The chronology is Israel expels nearly 250,000 Palestinians. The Arab public pressures the government to do something about it. And when they do, it's too late and too little. This is the chronology. It's amazing how American television, British television, history books in America and all over the West teach the Israeli chronology, which is the fabrication of truth, namely that nothing happened until the 15th of May. The Arab world enters Israel, they would call it invade Israel, and therefore, unfortunately, the Palestinians became victims of that war. This is one of the biggest success of the Israeli propaganda, which we have to refute because we have the facts on our side.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you for making that clear. Samia, is it all right if I move to the next clip, or do you have something you'd like to add to that? Oh, you're muted again. I think you're saying it's okay. I thought I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah. I just want to add that history is usually written by powerful people and by the victorious. I mean,
that's right. Exactly right.
There are so many lies in that.
what in a way is remarkable is that things have changed just enough that we are starting to change the narrative with events like this, with the fact that the UN now officially commemorates the Nakba, for which they had so much responsibility.
Well, it's high time after 75 years.
Exactly, I know. Too little, too late.
I don't know if they can
hopefully
do much about other than recognize it.
Sorry?
I said it's not enough to recognize it. They have to do something about it.
Right, right, exactly.
Yeah, but I doubt that they will.
Well, we're going to move now to some details about how this ethnic cleansing was accomplished. And I'm going to ask if we can do one clip after another. I'm really challenging Bridget here. Clip number 5 and clip number 6 about the Deir Yassin massacre and the operation called Cleansing the Levin, the cleansing of Haifa.
Just 2 miles from Kastal lay the Arab village of Deir Yassin. Early in the morning of April 9th, the same day as the funeral of al-Husseini, fighters from the Irgun set out for the village. Deir Yassin was one of many Arab villages that had signed a peace agreement with a neighboring Jewish village, so they did not expect an attack. The Haganah intelligence officer who reported on Deir Yassin was Mordechai Gichon.
Deir Yassin were only citizens. The village was completely peaceful.
أخوي رحمة الله عليه محمود ضرب سمع الصوت وده ضرب من هاك المنطلق ويعني 12 ساعة متتالية وهم يقتلوا ويقاتلوا اليهود.
A number of Arabs died resisting the attack, but a far larger group lost their lives well after the battle had ended. In all, Jewish fighters killed about 110 Arabs at Deir Yassin, most of them women, children, and the elderly.
People were mutilated, hand grenades were simply thrown into houses, women and children were killed, bodies stuffed down wells, jewelry stripped off fingers, fingers cut off, earlobes cut off.
رحت أنا ماشي بعرق الحيط مش من الشارع الرئيسي من البساتين. الفرن له شباك على جهة ولا اليهود في الفرن والنسوان قعدات على الأرض وكل واحدة قاعدة وحاطة إيديها على راسها هي وبقولوا للفران ارمي ابنك بالفرن ارمي ابنك بالفرن اسمه حامد. قال له أنا ما برمي ابني. قال له شوي. هم ضربوا الحاج حامد على راسه ومسكوا الولد رموه بالفرن. أنا شفت هالفرن شفت هالمنظر ما تمش فيها حيل من مرة يعني. بعدين مسكوا الأب حطوه وراه قالوا له الحق ابنك. أنا اجيت قعدت قلت هلا بيمسكوني قمت أركض.
After the massacre, they took the people which remained, they took them in a car and went through Jerusalem.
Irgun trucks full of survivors paraded up and down streets in Jewish neighborhoods. Spectators mocked, spit at, and even stoned the villagers.
مذبحة دير ياسين كانت هي الحافز الأكبر للقرى اللي تهرب بأولادها وأطفالها وبناتها ونسوانها.
قالوا أخذوا البنات يعني وفضعوا فين وسووا كذا وعملوا كذا. هذا اللي خلانا إحنا نشرد.
The massacre at Deir Yassin was far from the only massacre of the war, but it was the most widely publicized.
تسمع كل القرى في مذبحة دير ياسين.
دير ياسين دير ياسين
معركة دير ياسين مضرب دير ياسين.
دير ياسين أحداث دير ياسين.
By far the most massacres, rapes, atrocities, etc. were committed by Israelis, particularly after 1948 independence, then by Palestinians or by Arabs.
On April 19th, the British decided to pull out of downtown Haifa. Just hours after the withdrawal was complete on the 21st, the Haganah went into action.
The operation, with its very ominous name, cleansing the leaven. Leaven is the bread that is left before Passover, and as a Jew you are supposed to clean even the last crumb. Now if you apply it to people, you understand that the idea is to cleanse every person who lived in Haifa.
The Jewish attack on Haifa was accompanied by a massive indiscriminate bombardment by mortars. The Haganah also used loudspeaker trucks to broadcast recordings of shrieks, gunfire, explosions, and calls to flee for your lives. This tactic was used in many places by Jewish militias in 1948.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bridget. Well, we heard a lot there about the tactics that were being used to terrorize the population and murder them, but using murders and other tactics to terrorize a much larger number to flee. Samia, how does this compare to your experience of what you saw during this period? Ethnic cleansing that was done elsewhere or that you heard about, such as the massacre at Deir Yassin?
I was still a student at Birzeit. It was still a high school before it developed into university. And we had the headquarters of Abdul Qadir Husseini in Birzeit. And we were, as girls, we were knitting sweaters for their men. They were squatting under the trees, taking refuge. It was rather cool in April, you know, it was still cool. And all of a sudden, we heard that Abdul Qadir was killed in the Qastal battle around Jerusalem. And while everybody was mostly, all the men were at the funeral of Abdul Qadir Husseini, the next day, the Deir Yassin massacre took place. And it scared everybody. It scared everybody. And the Jewish militias were put in, they took few women and put them on trucks and went around all the neighbors of the Jerusalem, where the Palestinians' home were, you know, Upper Bakal or Qatamon and all these areas, saying, if you don't leave now, the same thing will happen to you as Deir Yassin. So everybody was so scared. They didn't even have time to pack anything. With whatever they had in front of them, they just packed and left. We were in Birzeit, and 3 of my aunts who were living in Jerusalem, 2 my maternal aunts and a paternal aunt, and a cousin of my father who was at the YMCA, was working at the YMCA, they all came to Birzeit. And of course, at that time, tension has mounted, and my father advised my aunt Nabiha, who was the school principal, to let the school come to an end so that its children will not be stuck. Many of them came from the rest of Palestine, from Haifa, Jaffa, Nazareth, all these areas. So we had enough room in the dorms and empty space to host all these cousins and aunts and with their children. And it was really, everybody was so tense and scared. But then everybody was saying, oh, it's just a matter of 2 weeks and we will go back. Even I remember one of my uncles who had a lot of sense of humor. He kept saying, we're coming for a picnic for 2 weeks, you know. And he kept saying afterwards, the picnic took much longer than 2 weeks, you know. And eventually he was the one who started the vocational school for the YMCA in Jericho, because we had lots of refugees in Birzeit who ended up there afterwards, after the, we'll talk about that later, maybe after the Lida and Ramleh exodus.
Thank you very much. Ilan, your thoughts about this history and how these tactics were being used?
Yes. The Plan D itself, the master plan, but also the commands were very clear about a few things. One is that it's better to force the people to flee than to expel them by force if possible. But if it's impossible to force them to flee, then one should expel them directly. And for that reason, usually the Zionist forces, later on Israeli forces, used to flank villages from three sides and leave one flank open so that people could escape. But sometimes they didn't kind of heed this idea, and they found themselves surrounding the villages without any chance of people to escape. And this is mostly when massacres happened. But the idea was actually not to bother too much with the reaction of the population. If it doesn't immediately evict the neighborhood or the village, they should be forced to do so. The second thing that both the plan and the commands show is that the villages and the neighborhoods were not treated as civilian spaces. They were treated as military bases, or rather as terrorist bases. So there's one chilling example. What happens when this is the perception? In April, the intelligence section of the Israeli forces had to clarify to the soldiers an earlier command that said, in every village and neighborhood, you should gather the men and find out who was a member of a gang and so on, and execute them, and the rest should be arrested. And the units wanted a clarification. What do you mean by man? Who is a man? And the chilling answer was anyone above the age of 10. And therefore we see scenes before May 48 and after 1948 of the separation, of the selection. Women and children are putting on one side, men are being put to the other side. And then the men, the women and children are being expelled. The men, some of them would be executed, and many of them would be sent into prisoner camps. And we owe it to the great scholar Salman Abu Sitta, who just only a few years ago was able to find out the International Red Cross documentation of these prison camps. For so many Palestinian men who spend there a year, sometimes a year and a half before being allowed to come back. So the method was, as in every ethnic cleansing, was not genocidal in the sense that the idea was not to kill as many Palestinians as possible, but to expel as many Palestinians as possible. But if you are expelling millions of people, you are unavoidably, you are also dehumanizing them to the extent that if you need to kill them, you do it without any hesitation. And one should say, of course, it is true that the Israeli forces used to threaten villages that what happened in Deir Yassin would happen to them. But one should say, Deir Yassin was the beginning of a series of about 40 massacres. So it was not just Deir Yassin that made people in Palestine think twice whether they should stay when the Israelis are coming. There were other massacres on the way, as horrendous as Deir Yassin, that created this fear among people that if they stay in their villages, they would be exposed to a similar fate. And finally, I would add to this that the biggest shock, I think, and this I know from the oral history I and many others have conducted, the Palestinians were used in their history to being occupied or by being ruled by different authorities. There were the Ottomans, then came the British, and some of them naively said, okay, now, the Israelis would be the rulers. And the first thing that the new ruler is doing is telling them to evict their villages or neighborhoods. And this was a great shock to them. And they were not a military unit. These were villages. And they were really no chance against the Israeli determination to ethnically cleanse them. It's quite surprising how such a crime against humanity that was known to so many people in the world was never fully condemned and acknowledged only now, 75 years later. But I think we are all aware of that.
Yeah, it's true. It is extraordinary that it has taken this long for the world to name honestly what was done then, to begin to at least. But I at least do have hope that we are beginning to change the narrative. It is one of the extraordinary things of this history, though, that back then, the Zionist movement and the Israelis were so successful in getting away with the crimes they were committing in full view of the world. All right, I'm going to skip through some clips a couple of short ones we were going to do and just state what they cover. As we've said, we've been talking about events that precede the end of the British Mandate and the actual declaration of the Israeli state. So the British did finish their evacuation and ended their mandate May 14th and May 15th. The declaration came by Ben Gurion to the world declaring that the Israeli state had been created. And in the video, we see celebrating similar to what accompanied the announcement of the UN partition plan, but even on a larger scale. Celebrating by Jews in Israel and in other parts of the world. And with that, the attacks on Palestinian cities and towns continued, but an enormous amount had been accomplished already at that point. And soon after that, there was a short truce that had been declared in July of 48. And as soon as that ended, Israelis targeted the towns of Ramli and Lida. There is another video that we're not going to have time for about Operation Danny, which was targeting Ramli and Lida. But and it is similar to what we've already been hearing about in videos and from our speakers was being done in these other cities and towns. But Sammy, I think you have some specific memories of the refugees from those communities, Ramli and Lida. If you could share those with us, that would be great.
That memory is still etched in my head, and I'll never forget this trauma. So I can imagine what these people went through. I was reading, it was summer in the hot months of July, and I was sitting on the veranda and reading. And then all of a sudden we saw these droves of people walking, and I ran downstairs to see what's happening. And it turned out that the people of Ramli and Lida were evicted at gunpoint, and they were ripped off of their finances and whatever they could carry, money and jewelry. I mean, they were not allowed to carry anything. So they took at least these possessions, and they thought they could survive on them for a while. They lost things. And it was, you can imagine what it meant for whole families with children walking all this distance from Ramle to Berzeit, and then some of them went on to Ramallah. But the bulk of them were in that area. And of course, when everybody saw this, my aunt, who was the principal of the school, she said, get out everything in the storeroom, and let's just feed these people. They haven't eaten anything for the last 2-3 days as they walked their way. We got out I'll never forget the number of potatoes and eggs that we boiled, the number of tomatoes and cucumbers that we chopped that day and bringing out, preserved in the school. We had so much preserved the cheese and Lebanese and oil and all that. We put everything out for them. And we hosted some also in one of the boys' schools, which was already empty in them, and the mosque opened their doors and the churches opened their doors and hosted a lot of them at the time. And it was so sad. It was so sad. We went, the Red Cross sent a nurse to help, and we'd go under the trees. That most of them stayed under the trees. It was in July and it was warm enough, but it was very hot, of course, at the same time, to sit under the trees. And we'd go and help her and check on children mostly. I mean, the children were in a very, very bad situation. It was so sad. I'll never forget that day. It was a memorable day in the history of our people. And with all these refugees, then my father decided, he said, we should document all these information. And it was the first census that was done actually for any Palestinian refugees. So he got us, all of us, the young people of the town and the family, as volunteers to do this job. And we went around and recording where everybody came from, how many children they had, and which villages, because along Ramle and Ridda, many villages joined, of course, the escape. And the Red Cross even recognized that important work, and he was cited a merit for that, and an appreciation for what he did. And actually, these documents were the first documents that were handed into the UNRWA when they took over after the Red Cross, and they were the first documents for refugees. And later on, as I was telling you, this uncle of mine, many of these refugees ended up in Jericho. And he started a vocational school for the YMCA in Jericho, which is still, I think, running up to this day, the vocational school in Jericho for the refugees in the Aqab Jabal camp, which is one of the largest camps and actually the YWCA, the World YWCA, was one of the first organizations that came to work at the YWCA at the refugee camp as to relieve the people and teach them some skills to do so that they can work and earn a living. It was a real catastrophe,
It's so valuable to have someone with us who can tell us from a personal perspective that it really happens. This isn't just something written down on paper or in a movie. This is your life and the life of millions of others.
I know I didn't experience running away because we were already in school, but witnessing this will never make me forget that incident at all.
Ilan, I'm going to skip ahead to another video because this is a great segue to our clip number 9, which is about the refugees. Truly one of the core issues of the entire conflict, one that the conflict will never be resolved. There will never be peace in the in Israel and Palestine until the issue of the Palestinian refugees is resolved, and justly. And Bridget, can you play for us clip number 9?
In October, the truce came to an end and fighting resumed.
By this time, all the Arab armies had been pretty much defeated, and the Israeli army was the dominant force.
The Israeli army focused on clearing out villages in the 2 parts of the country where Palestinians remained, the Galilee in the north and the Negev desert in the south. Hava Keller arrived in the town of Beersheba in the Negev shortly after it was captured by the Israelis on October 21st.
And we came wonderful. You came just on time. And tomorrow we are showing out the Arabs from Beersheba. You are going to help. Of course, I'm going to help. Next day I got our gun. We prepared several bashes. I think there was 10 or 12 bashes. And we called all the Arabs from Beersheba to come to the bashes. And I was standing like everybody with a gun, so nobody will try to run away, and all of them will go into the cars and go to Gaza. And they are in Gaza today, until today.
Nobody had an idea that this is a complete expulsion. It's a kind of war which will stop one day and you go back home. Wars happened all over the world. Towns have been occupied. Countries have been occupied. When the war was over, people got back home. Why should we be different?
Were this just an accident of war, then that accident of war would have been repaired within a few months of the implementation of Plan Dalet by the return of these people to their villages. They were not allowed to return.
בחודשים האחרונים של המלחמה היו ניסיונות לא לחזור אולי, אבל להסתנן, לקחת ציוד וכן הלאה.
هلا بعد ما هالفار 5 اشهر 7 اشهر المصاري الان مطلعينا خلصه، البلد فيها الشغل واواعينا اللي لابسينها مزعه. شو بدنا نعمل؟ الله ابوي لامي قال لنا نازل على فلسطين، كيف بدك تنزل؟ قال لنا نازل ونازل على الكابري. إذا رجعت بعد يعني 15 يوم رجعت، ما رجعت بكون انقتلت.
Then one day we got an order to take the jeeps and spread out and to shoot every Arab whom we saw coming in, coming back. And this is what happened.
The thinking behind this was political but essentially strategic. The Arabs, refugees who had been fighting, they were the Palestinians who had been fighting against the Jews. And they said if we allow these back, they will overwhelm us as a fifth column, or they will overwhelm us demographically. In other words, there will be hundreds of thousands of additional Arabs, and they will become a majority or close to a majority instantly if they return. So the Israeli cabinet decided not to allow them back.
In 1947, there had been between 500 and 700 Arab villages in the area that eventually became Israel. When the dust of the war settled, all but around 100 had been emptied of their population. 700,000 to 800,000 Palestinians had fled their homes, about 8 out of every 10 Palestinians who lived in the area that became Israel. For decades after the war, the Israeli government claimed that they bore no responsibility for the flight of the Palestinians. Many Israelis still make this claim.
We never wanted them to leave. Nobody told them to leave the area or otherwise.
Don't tell me that nobody was forced to leave home. Everybody was forced to leave home.
There is consensus on the fact that there was a large-scale displacement of Palestinians. There is also consensus on the fact that this displacement was forced. Some people fled out of fear. Some people fled because there were massacres. Some people fled because rumors were spread about massacres. And some people fled because they didn't just flee, they were actually actively expelled at gunpoint. All of this happened.
يعني أكبر من مأساة إني أترك بلدي وملكي وأرضي وبيتي وأطلع منه مشرد لاجئ. هاي أكبر مأساة.
Imagine yourself if you are living in your home, suddenly you find yourself only with a shirt, nothing more. Your past is denied. They say, there are no Palestinians. Nobody was living here.
לא היו אפשרויות רבות. זאת אומרת, זה היה או אנחנו או הם, זה ברור. כי אם הם היו מנצחים, לא היינו אנחנו פה.
Okay. That, I think, reinforces a lot of what we've talked about, that clearly this was an intentional plan to ethnically cleanse the land, to change the demographics so that there would be a Jewish majority for this state that was being created, and to never let them come back. There's two aspects of it I think we haven't covered, and we're going to need to address them really quickly. And I will let our audience know that clearly we are going past our time. We're going to try to wrap this up in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 minutes. So for both of our speakers, that gives you 1 or 2 minutes to address this subject, and then we still have one more thing to talk about. So the question I have is, in terms of the ramifications on the broader picture, the international ramifications of making such a decision that they can refuse to ever let the refugees return. What does that mean, do you think, today? How does this need to be addressed? And then I have a follow-up question for you. Either of you that would like to jump in, that would be fine. Go ahead, Ilan.
Okay. It's important to understand that the United Nations already in the end of on the 11th of December 1948 passed a resolution 194 that recognized the right of the Palestinian refugees to return, not as a political act, but just as a commonsensical humanitarian act, so that people after fighting are entitled to go back to their homes. And in fact, even the American State Department supported that resolution, and the resolution was reaffirmed year after year with American support roughly until the early 1970s. So the international community, on the one hand, never doubted the right of the Palestinian refugees to return, and never accepted the Israeli explanation why they do not allow the refugees to return. But the international community didn't do anything to force Israel to change a position that, according to international law and according to the Convention of Refugees, was a violation of these convention and law. That was a very important message to the Israelis that would impact their behavior later on in other aspects. It's very clear that whoever talks the talk will never walk the walk when it comes to Israel. And Israelis to this very day believe that this is really the situation. So they're never worried about what people are saying or whether they are violating international law, because they know that nobody will take action against them. So I think that's one aspect of this Israeli policy of not allowing the refugees to return. But I think there is a more profound aspect for this. And this is something that is not being talked about enough. The main reason Israel did not allow the Palestinian refugees to return is racism. It's racism. It's pure racism. This very decision not to allow the refugees to return shows that the West is calling a racist state the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is based on a deep, Americans should recognize it. Americans know what racism is. This is a deep racism. The problem is that after the Holocaust, people are not allowed to talk about Jewish racism. You can talk about Christian racism, definitely you can talk about Muslim racism, but you're not allowed to say that the Jewish state is racist. It's like Holocaust denier, definitely anti-Semitism. But this is the heart of the issue. There is no other explanation apart from racism, not to allowing the Palestinians to return. I mean, I mean, even the kind of dry way in which Benny Morris says, well, the Israeli government thought it's not good that there will be a demographic change when they come back. It was not a demographic change. This was the reality that Israel by force changed. It was not, these were not Palestinians who voluntarily immigrated to other countries and then had second thoughts. These were victims of expulsions. And you cannot kind of disconnect the crime of expulsion from the crime of not allowing repatriation. But again, like the whole message from the international community about the destruction of villages, about the massacres, and about not allowing the refugees, the whole message to the state of Israel was not only that you will not be condemned for doing that, we will still regard you as the only democracy in that region. That is something that the whole region is suffering from, this hypocrisy and double talk and exceptionalism. I do hope that there are signs that that might change with the help of the current Israeli governments, who really pose a real challenge to anybody who's saying about this or talking about Israel as a democratic state nowadays. But it was always the issue. It didn't start this year. It was always the issue.
Thank you so much for naming the racism that is behind all of this. In fact, the very desire to create an ethnically homogeneous society, a Jewish society. The basis of that is racial preference. And of course, that was learned in Europe from those who were oppressing the Jews. So they carried that idea with them and wanted to perpetuate it for themselves. And Samia, I forgive me, but I'm going to jump to the last video, and I will definitely give you the first chance to respond to that.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, I just want to comment on the not being allowed to go back. I want to say that even those who were evicted from their homes, like the people who were living in Haifa and ended up in Nazareth, they could not go back to their homes in Haifa. I mean, this is also inside Israel itself, they could not go back to their homes, which is, I think, also
internally
just very important point.
Yeah, that is. So they still didn't ever get to go back to home.
No.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very good. All right. We're going to go to, there's a video we're going to skip talking about the destruction of villages, which was another important part of not allowing the refugees to return, either planting over them completely and trying to remove any trace of them, or take them and turn them into Jewish communities without any trace of their Arab culture. And this happened with hundreds of villages, 400 to 500 villages that existed in what became Israel. This was done, an enormous cultural genocide, as we call it, and a practical measure to make it virtually impossible for the refugees to find anything to return to. And now I'd like to go, Bridget, if we can, to our last clip, number 11.
The war came to an end in 1949. On the 11th of May, the United Nations formally recognized the State of Israel.
It was a feeling of creation.
הייתה הרגשת התעלות, בוודאי, שביתת הנשק, קווים סוכרו.
The United Nations partition plan had allotted 56% of Palestine to the Jewish state. As a result of the war, the State of Israel now covered 78% of the land, all of Palestine, except an area around the west bank of the Jordan River, including East Jerusalem, and a small strip of land around the town of Gaza.
זאת אומרת, ההישג היה עצום, היה בלתי נתפס. איזה ארץ גדולה קיבלנו, או כבשנו, או הכירו בה.
But we couldn't be very happy, and we couldn't be very glad because we lost all these people. And also, I don't remember
us being very happy, but the Israelis didn't fight who were the parents and the parent generation, they were very happy because their families are now might come and there will be a state, but the state is not always a great thing. Fighting for a state is much better than for a state.
In the beginning, we are very happy about it, but after a short time, I started being not very happy. Where are they? Palestinians. Are they coming back? Are they coming back? What will happen now?
Here we have these two things intertwined with one another. The realization of a dream and the destruction of a society.
The Zionist movement was successful in establishing the State of Israel. But the dream of a safe haven for the Jewish people has not been realized. Since the end of the 1948 war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has only grown more complicated and intractable. And the hopes, fears, and grievances that drove the conflict in 1948 are still central to the conflict today. Israelis build more and more settlements in the occupied West Bank, and Palestinians continue to be cut off from their homes and livelihood by military occupation, home demolition, checkpoints, curfews, and the construction of a wall that runs deep into Palestinian territory. As a result, Israel now controls nearly all of historic Palestine.
Here's the question. Was the establishment of the State of Israel so important that no matter what price Palestinians had to pay for it, it was worth it? Or was there something fundamentally wrong with a project that can only be realized by displacing hundreds of thousands of people? If the establishment of the State of Israel was a historic wrong, then the question now arises, how does one redress this wrong?
Okay. I'd like to ask for your final thoughts about what we've covered about the aftermath of the Nakba, and a particular thing that was said briefly in one of the clips, that they had no choice but to do this way, the Zionists did. It was us or them. If we had not succeeded, we could not be here. I'm wondering if you think that's true, if there was another way to go about this, another vision that the Zionists could have had, and what is your vision for what needs to happen now to address this wrong? Sami, I'll ask you.
I don't really know. It takes a prophet maybe to think what can happen. With we see how impotent the United Nations has been. The redressing of the grave injustice should have taken place many, many years ago. Every year, the same resolutions are taken, the right of return of refugees, even after 1967. The return of all the occupied territories by force was inadmissible and should be returned to the Palestinians, and nothing is taken. Every day the violations take place in the West Bank, now in the occupied territories, and all we hear are the Europeans and the Americans saying it is not conducive to peace, it does not help a two-state solution. There is nothing that can be achieved by words. They have to take action. Nobody tries to even impose sanctions on Israel. Nobody dares even. I mean, the next day after Russia attacked Ukraine, the whole world was up in arms, you know, imposing sanctions on Russia. And we haven't heard one word against what is happening from the international community or from those who really tip the balance in the United Nations, I mean, the Security Council and all these resolutions. They have not been able to achieve anything. And of course, it's always the anti-Semitism and the worry of being labeled anti-Semitic, you know, makes people halt a bit and so on. This is so unfair, so unfair. I don't know. Tell you the truth, I don't know whether it will be possible. Okay. Although any injustice will always be the source of problems for the region until the injustice is redressed. But it certainly will not be taking place in my lifetime. I'll be 90 very soon, and I'm not sure I will see that day. Maybe the young people.
I understand. It's very discouraging. I think on the ground there, we can't imagine how discouraging it is to hear and see what the governments of the world are doing. I know that I speak for thousands, if not millions, in this movement for Palestinian liberation, that we won't give up and we will continue to stand with you. And it's perhaps a luxury that we have on this side of the Atlantic where I am in the US, that we do take hope in the small signs of change that we're seeing. Bills being introduced to Congress for Palestinian rights with at least a few dozen supporters, whereas 5-10 years ago, no such bill would have existed, let alone had a single supporter.
Right.
So, and the bill in question, the new one, HR 3103, we don't call it sanctions, but it would withhold aid to Israel based on human rights violations, so a form of sanctions. So it's still a long way coming. I know it's too slow, it's too little, but we will continue to stand with you and to push and to push and to push until we succeed. Ilan, can I ask for your final thoughts on
yeah, in a sentence, because I have to move to another webinar. I'm sorry.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
1:45, and as I told you,
yes, this is your time to
it
go.
really went, which is good. No, I just took 2 short sentences, then I would leave you. I do apologize. I have another webinar. The first thought is that there was an option. Of course, there was another option. The United Nations even suggested almost with a majority, the idea of having a unitary state in 1947. The Jews were 20% of the population. The Palestinians were willing to have them in a post-colonial Palestine, give them basic all the rights, and create a country which was Palestinian with a Jewish minority in it. This is 48. There was no danger for the Jews of Europe anymore. And of course, there was a possibility, and even one small group called Brit Shalom, the Peace Alliance, suggested it, and Palestinians were willing to discuss it. As for the future, we are in a different position now. We are in existential danger for the Palestinian people from the present or the last few Israeli governments. They are using incremental genocide, ethnic cleansing. There is an urgency for the world to intervene. The Palestinians cannot stop it by themselves. And the world should by now, 75 years on, understand not what only happened in 1948, but should also respond to what goes on today. And this is as bad as 1948, what goes on today. So we can only hope to make sure that what so many people in civil society understand finally would influence governments, not only in the West, but all over the world, because the Palestinians would need international aid to stop the continued destruction of Palestine and the Palestinians. And I do apologize that I'm leaving you, but there's a large group of people from somewhere else in the world waiting for me. So
who need to hear from you.
I will leave you here, and thank you so much for having me. And this was a great webinar, and thank you all for your work. And it was lovely seeing you, Samia, and good health and long. We need you. We need you in the next 50 years. So don't give up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hope is always, I mean, my target is hope. I mean,
yeah, we should always
the journey of hope. Because
thank you very much. It was so good to be with all of you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan. You made our webinar very meaningful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you to both of you, even though we've just lost Ilan. I think that we heard so much that was valuable, and for those who needed to understand better what the roots of this conflict are about, I think they had a great opportunity to learn from both of you. So, Bridget, I'm going to turn this back over to you now. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for joining us. As we've mentioned before, this has been recorded and it will be shared in the next couple of days. You'll also probably receive an email with a recording. It'll be up on both of our YouTube channels and websites. That's UMKR and MFSA. We will also be coming and gathering again for another conversation in July. And so if this is the first time with us, you will be added to our email list and you'll get further information on our next webinar in July. So I hope that you can join us, and we please also ask that you share, share the recording, invite others into this conversation. Thank you again, and we will see you in July.